You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hobb,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kate Hope Day.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. We've got a fantastic show for you today. But before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about a couple of sponsors who make the show possible each and every day. Craig Allanson has a brand new book. It's a spinoff of the Expeditionary Force series, Expeditionary Force Mavericks, Book 1, Death Trap. The human soldiers stranded on the planet Paradise have been recruited into an alien legion to do the dirty jobs that the high-tech species won't do. Their first mission is to kick the enemy off a backwater planet no one cares about. It's a simple assignment, except everyone has a hidden agenda, and the planet could become a death trap. Craig Allanson's brand new book, Death Trap. Also thanks to Ernie Lindsay with his Sarah series, the psychological thriller series that begins with Sarah, has books 1 through 3 and a bonus novella, Single Mother, Successful Executive, Target for Revenge. The psychological thriller series box set, Sarah Winthrop's world is thrown headlong into a whirlwind of chaos, along with her family, friends, and colleagues, by unseen enemies seeking revenge. Those lurking in the shadows, clawing for vengeance, will go to any lengths. Any lengths. It's likely never occurred to them that they may have just messed with the wrong woman. The Sarah series, books 1 through 3 and a bonus novella by Ernie Lindsay. Also, John L. Monk with the Jenkins Cycle. From Book 1, Kick, a supernatural thriller. They say suicides are damned for eternity, but if possessing the bodies of violent criminals is hell, then Dan Jenkins will take it, and he does, every time a portal arrives to whisk him from his ghostly exile. Normally, before the villain returns to kick him out, Dan dishes out a final serving of justice and leaves the world a safer place. It's one of the rules if he wants more rides, and he's happy to oblige. For a part-time dead guy, it's a pretty good gig. And then he meets her. Kick is the first book in a series of supernatural thrillers. If you like Quantum Leap and Everyday, you'll love this gritty and original take on the body-hopping hero story. Vividly written, Kick is a wild ride with a sharp, sarcastic wit and a flawed, yet likable main character. From John L. Monk, The Jenkins Cycle, Book 1, Kick. And from M.D. Massey, Invasion, Zombie Apocalypse. The action-packed first novel in M.D. Massey's Them Zombie Apocalypse series. When a surprise nuclear attack forces Aiden from hiding, he finds the world to be a much different place and more deadly. Now he'll traverse a post-apocalyptic landscape populated by violent redneck looters, rogue military factions, and an army of hungry undead. After 2 combat tours in the Middle East, Aiden Sullivan just wants to be left alone on his family's ranch in the Texas Hill Country. But when the bombs fall and the dead walk, Aiden risks life and limb to rescue his aging parents from the zombie horde. To save them, he'll traverse half the state of Texas while fighting rogue military units, violent redneck looters, and thousands of walking dead. The question is, can he make it there in time? Only one thing's for sure, this ranger will complete the mission or he'll die trying. M.D. Massey's Invasion, Zombie Apocalypse. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Kate Hope Day on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book called If Then, and this book is amazing, guys. I got a copy of it over the weekend a couple of days ago, and I've been tearing through it, and this is an amazing book. Welcome to the show, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. Kate, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I have to answer that question by saying that all my origin stories are really as a reader rather than a writer.
Sure.
When I was growing up, my dad taught English literature. My mom was a librarian, and we had overstuffed bookcases everywhere. And probably my earliest memory of anything is opening a book that I didn't understand and trying to sort of decipher, whatever couple illustrations were in there. I remember a copy of the Odyssey, that had maybe like 4 illustrations in it, and sort of trying to figure out what these books were all about. And I also remember a copy of Jane Eyre, which I believe was my mom's copy from college, that had sort of like her writing in it. And this was before I could read even. And I remember just spending a lot of time with their bookcases. And then as I grew up, I also have these very distinct memories of going to visit my mom after school and just kind of hanging out in the stacks and wandering around and picking things up. And again, I could read at that point, but was probably, 10, 11, 12, and didn't really understand the, Thomas Pynchon that I picked up because the cover looked so interesting to me. And I remember the smell of the books, and that there were so many of them, and that they were all different. And wouldn't it be incredible if somehow I could manage to read them all? But I will say that while I wasn't a kid that wrote, millions of stories in journals and always wanted to be a writer. And that I probably even now identify as a reader first and writer second. But I will say that I always made things. I had many, many notebooks of drawings. And when I got a little older, I became obsessed with photography, and I used to do these sort of narrative books of photographs. And then in college, I made short films. So while I wasn't, typing away at a typewriter or anything like that, I was always making stories in a sense. And I wonder, as I'm telling you this story, I wonder if I never really wrote, fiction, because I was still intimidated by all those books.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's
books.
Plausible for sure.
And I really didn't write fiction until I had my first child. And that's when I felt like I had something to say that I could add to that big room of books.
Yeah. With all of the books and the bookcases at home and your dad, and and your mom, just kind of immersing your life and story, so early. Did you guys talk about books, or did they just kind of create an atmosphere where it was always open and welcome?
I mean, both. I think, books were a given. Some people grow up where religion is sort of like permeates every part of your life. And for me, that was books. So it was definitely often a topic of conversation, and we always read before bed. And I always had access to, whatever book I wanted, either going to the library or going to my dad's office and taking things off the bookshelves there. We had a lot of books at home. So it seemed like, when you're growing up, whatever you have seems normal to you. And it was only when, I started going over to friends' houses and things like that I realized that not everyone had stacks of books everywhere in their houses. And I think just thinking about just thinking about being a human being and your experience, and sort of thinking about that in terms of books. That was always sort of the way that things were framed as I was growing up.
When you go to a friend's house and you realize, oh, I'm the weird friend. Okay, I get it. Yeah, I was that kid too. I get it.
Yeah, that's where I had access to TV
Right.
and other wonderful things that I have since, fallen in love with. But yes.
When you were really into photography and creating these narrative pieces with pictures, and then even in your work with short film, I'm always fascinated with the intersection of different art forms and different forms of expression. Do you feel like that time working with still photos and film, do you feel like that has informed your writing, or informed maybe the way you perceive things and then are able to translate those perceptions to the page?
Absolutely. I think probably it's the thing that I draw from the most, aside from, my graduate work where I just read lots and lots of novels. I mean, that's a big part of the way I work as a writer. But aside from that, this just having spent a lot of time and in various mediums, photography, film. I worked briefly in television at HBO, sort of how you tell a story visually. And I think I'd spent enough time kind of working in those mediums that it became a part of me. And so when I'm writing, I'm not necessarily thinking to myself, I'm writing cinematically right now, but I think it's a natural thing that I do, that I have. When I'm writing a scene, I definitely am seeing it playing out in my mind in a visual sense. And I think that's sort of where I start. And then because it's a novel and you get to do a whole lot more than that, I sort of start with the visual. I start with the cinematic, how something's going to look, where the person is standing, what's in the background, the expression on their face. And then once I have that down, that's when I start to sort of layer the other senses, smells, what you can hear, what things feel like. But yeah, I usually start with this sort of visual. And I think I also really, when I get stuck, that's where I go. I open a book of paintings. I go to a museum and stare at some photographs. That's how I get my brain stuck, when I'm a little too deep in the sentences.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. You said that motherhood really inspired you to start writing, and that you felt like then you had something to say. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah. So my book, If Then, which follows 4 neighbors in an Oregon town who start to have some strange visions that they don't entirely understand, which as the book unfolds, you start to realize they're seeing glimpses of an alternate reality, and that those glimpses are like their life, but not quite, with some startling differences. And this idea really grew out of two kind of big life changes. I moved to Oregon, and I had my first child. Sort of 2 forks in the road, 2 changes that got me thinking about what my life might have been like if we'd moved somewhere else, if I'd had a daughter instead of a son, if I hadn't had kids, if we'd waited, we'd had kids earlier. And I sort of had these narratives, these imagined or ghost lives in my mind, kind of running alongside my actual life. And I think there's something, it's a very, very peculiar moment in life when you've just had a child, especially when you've moved someplace where you don't know a lot of people that's very different from where you grew up. And I was in this sort of like state of being quite isolated. And that's where the story came from. This thinking about, what would the me that didn't have a child be doing right now? You know, she'd be out in the world. She'd be maybe working. She'd be pursuing a career. What would the me that stayed back on the East Coast be doing? And I think when you're holding a baby and you don't get to get out a lot, your mind starts to wander. And at least for me, this is sort of the direction that it went in. And then the other aspect to this that I think any parent can relate to, and this I think only intensifies as your kids get older, is this sense that you just want to be in two places at once all the time. And I mean, you really need three of you. I would love to have me that's, you know, sort of really tied in and connected with my husband and can finish a conversation with him. And the me that's, you know, truly present all the time for my kids. And then the me that gets to write my books and be totally focused on my career. And I think, you know, the book really grew out of this kind of emotional impulse of just, well, what if, you know, you could simultaneously have many different lives and get the sort of fulfillment of, you know, getting to be all the things you want to be at once.
Right. The title of the book is really provocative. As someone who studied computer programming 100 years ago, you know, one of the cores of telling a machine what to do is if-then statements. So you start going through, if this happens, then do this. And it's a great way to conceptualize a stream of logic. But also it can open up new branches and new possibilities, because if this happens, then this happens, and then if this happens, and you know, you quickly can kind of lose control of all of the possibilities that could happen. How did the story first come to you? I know you're going through this experience of being a parent and new experiences and needing more of you. How did that start morphing into a story? Well, I
think the sort of emotional impulse behind the book was what was going on with me personally, you know, becoming a new mother, being in this new place. But then there was also this kind of intellectual impulse behind the book, which was that I had just finished my graduate work in English, and I had spent a lot of time, since I did sort of an interdisciplinary project, I spent a lot of time taking courses in philosophy and history and philosophy of science. And so I had just come from this experience of working in an area of philosophy called modal realism, and I had read the work of David Lewis, who very sort of is the philosophical side of what you were describing in computer programming. And he argued that any counterfactual statement that you can make, which is an if-then scenario, exists in the multiverse. And he believed that all those scenarios actually are real. And so that all those statements that you could make about yourself or about the world exist in some form. And I sort of had some of that reading that I had done in this area of metaphysics in the back of my mind. And that combined with this sort of unique moment of being alone at home with my son. I think that's sort of it's hard to totally pinpoint where ideas come from, but I think of it as sort of like a soup from which, a soup of ideas and emotions and, anxieties from which the book came.
Yeah, a lot of times where we are originally from and our experiences growing up shape the way we write, and a lot of times become those settings and those things that are deeply familiar to us become a character in the novel almost. Your book is similar. I mean, it is that Oregon becomes very much part of the story. But you're not from there. How did being a new person there help you to kind of encapsulate this place as part of the story and it's so ingrained?
Yeah, this was a big part of kind of unlocking the world of the novel for me as I was writing, because I was writing the book at the same time as I was falling in love with this place that we had moved to. My husband's from the Pacific Northwest, so he had a sense of what it was going to be like, but I had only been to Oregon once, and I think it was, a day in Portland. So I really did not know what to expect when we moved here, and I'm from the East Coast, from Pennsylvania. It's quite different in so many ways, but the part of moving to Oregon that just enchanted me was at first the weather, which we kind of get a bad rap for constant rain, but it's not quite like that all the time. It's a place where you can wake up and the whole world is cloaked in fog. You can go through a day where there is sunshine, rain, hail, a rainbow, all in one day. It's very changeable. It often is very mysterious as you're winding your way through a forest, and it's foggy or there's misty rain. And I think not being from Oregon, these things struck me in a way that they just sometimes I think don't for people who grew up here. I still cannot get over the fact that the grass stays green here. Where I grew up, the grass turns brown in winter. And I remarked on this to my husband when we first moved here, and it had just never occurred to him to sort of notice that. And I think that's emblematic of, some of the ways that you can kind of have this kind of fresh perspective if you're not from a place. And the other part of Oregon, I've always had, it's kind of random because I don't have a background in this, but I've always had this interest in geology, and Oregon is incredibly interesting when it comes to geology. We're within the Ring of Fire. There are a lot of dormant volcanoes. And so the physical world here, it's not such a stretch to make it a character in a book because you feel that it is a character in your life. Right. It really is ever present. And so that's how that was sort of the key for me to sort of get that down on the page. And then the world of the novel really grew from all of those sort of physical and sensory details that are just part of my regular everyday life here.
How did you come up with the characters for this book? So we've got kind of these big concepts and start looking at how your life is changing and the experiences you're having. But how did you start to personify these experiences in the characters that you chose for the book?
So the book started with Cass, who was most like me at the time. She has also just come from an experience of being a scholar. She has a new baby. She feels isolated. And so I definitely started with her. It's interesting now when I go and do readings of the book and I read sections from her point of view. My kids are older now, so we aren't the same anymore. But when I was writing her, it definitely was really personal. But then I had this idea in my mind that she lived in a cul-de-sac very similar to ones that I would run past as I was out running with my dog when I would get a little break from the baby when my husband got home. So I had this idea that she was in one house kind of alone. And then I sort of looked left and there was Samara and her dad. And I looked right and there were Ginny and Mark and Noah. And it sort of went from there. I definitely had some inspirations for some of those characters. My husband works in a medical field, so I was able to draw from that for Ginny. She's a surgeon. And then I live in a college town where there are a lot of scientists. I actually personally know 3 different people who work on frogs. So I definitely drew from that. For Mark, who's a wildlife biologist who studies how animals can predict natural disasters, and his sort of specific area of study is frogs.
I love it. That's amazing. Kate, as you're working through this book and you start exploring all the possibilities and okay, well, if I've got this idea, what does this mean? And as you start putting your characters in and playing with the idea of the multiverse and more of us, and I don't want to give away too much of the book. I'll let you say what you want about it. But what were some things that you discovered in kind of going through these mental exercises of, okay, if I do this, then this happens, and really going through the if-then of the writing process, which I love the play on words here that just kind of permeates this whole thing. But as you're going through that, what are some things, some conclusions that you come to that surprised you as a writer?
I think the most important thing that I learned as I sort of did this thought experiment of, what if you had these 4 characters, and what if they saw a version of their life where they made, where they had made a different choice, or things that happened to go a different way. As I sort of worked that out over the course of the novel, I think the thing that struck me was a hopeful thing, which is that this is a human capacity that we have. I'm not unique. We all have these kind of what if moments. What if I had taken that other job? What if I married someone else? What if I, decided to have a 3rd child? And so as the book kind of grew out from my more personal, preoccupations and my own personal experiences, the thing that really struck me was that capacity to imagine, another life, another way of being. I mean, that's how we make a change if we want to. That's where we can remake ourselves if our lives are not going the way we want them to. And it's also the way that we can look at our life and think, oh, you know what I have is pretty great, and to be grateful for what we do have. And I think that ability to sort of imagine the alternatives feels uniquely human, and it feels like sort of the conduit to hopefulness and optimism.
Kate, just about every writer that I know struggles in one way or another with balancing writing with the rest of life, with family. Maybe it's a day job. Maybe it's, just finding time to be creative while also juggling all the other important things of life. Have you developed any things that help you with that? And do you hold your writing time and your writing space as sacred? Or can you just write anywhere?
For sure. This is the perpetual challenge, isn't it? And it's, for me, it's definitely balancing kids and work. But for other people, it's a day job. It's caring for, aging parents. I mean, there's a lot of ways that this can be a challenge. But for me, when I was writing If Then, I didn't have a workspace. I didn't necessarily have even set aside writing time. I wrote when my kids were sleeping, during nap times, after my husband and my children had gone to bed, in little stolen moments. And so it took me quite a while to finish the book in that way. So when I was able to sell the book, I got I have a small workspace, which is where I'm speaking to you from. And it felt like such a luxury. And at that point, my kids were in some kind of, preschool, school. And I would usually have at the beginning about 3 hours every morning to write. And the change between the two is very stark. But I will say that experience of writing a book when, you don't necessarily have a set aside space or a set aside time taught me some tricks. And I think for me, the main thing is the main challenge is sort of keeping the project alive in your mind. Yes, you want more time, you want to be at your computer, but I think part of what's so difficult about juggling, writing and family or writing and other obligations is that when you're doing those other things, that world, that character, that story can kind of die a little. And then once you get back to it, it's very hard to sort of get back into what you had been working on. So some of the things that I do is, if I'm working from home, my laptop is always open and it sits in my bedroom. And even if I don't get to sit down and work on it, I will see it in the corner of my eye and say, whatever, my kids go outside for a little bit, I will grab like 15 minutes and just kind of even just read the last thing I wrote. The other thing I do is I carry pages with me everywhere. The If Then went to robotics club, the aquatic center, school pickup, school drop off. Pages of that book have been probably every kid oriented place in my town that you can think of. And, I just find a moment to sort of read what I last wrote or think about whatever plot problem I'm working on. And it's not that you get that much done sitting at the side of the pool during, swim lessons. It's that you kind of checking in with those pages keeps the book alive in your mind so that tomorrow when you get your maybe 3 hours at the coffee shop to really focus, it doesn't take you a whole hour to sort of get back into the project.
That is fantastic advice. Just always keeping the story alive is paramount. That's amazing advice. Kate, the new book is fantastic. I love it. We're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of If Then. If people are just discovering you and want to learn more about you and follow along with you as you go on this journey, is there a place online they could connect with you?
Yes, I am very active on Twitter and Instagram, and you can find me on both of those places at Kate Hope Day, KateHopeday. And then my website is the same. It's katehopeday.com.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to see you. Kate, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Knoll was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke! It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Knoll. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dillon!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond. And in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God. He served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.